In the summer skies over Europe, the fate of nations was written not just in ink on surrender papers, but in contrails and the roar of engines. When the Second World War erupted, no one knew which machines would come to define the air war, or which nations would summon the industrial might to flood the skies with their creations. Germany's Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the spearhead of the Luftwaffe, a sleek, lethal fighter that embodied the Reich's early dominance. By war's end, over 33,000 had been built, an extraordinary number, one of the most produced fighters in history. But across the Atlantic a new legend would rise, forged not in the first desperate years of battle, but in the later crucible of Allied determination. America's North American P-51 Mustang, a machine designed almost by accident, would eventually roll out in staggering numbers, 49,000 strong, becoming the very wings that carried bombers deep into the heart of Germany, and the symbol of an industrial juggernaut that could outbuild, outfuel, and outlast the Reich. This is the story of two aircraft born in different worlds, fighting in the same skies. It is a story of design genius and industrial willpower, of men who strapped themselves into cockpits where seconds meant the difference between glory and death. But it is also a story of nations, the gamble of Hitler's Reich and the awakening power of the United States, whose factories turned rivers of steel and aluminum into flying arsenals. What happens when one nation builds faster than its enemy? Can destroy? When ingenuity meets industry at a scale never before seen in history. Tonight, we travel back to the skies of World War II to witness how the Messerschmitt and the Mustang shaped the outcome of the greatest conflict humanity has ever endured. The skies of Europe in 1939 were a canvas of uncertainty. Clouds of war gathered over the continent, and from the very first days of the conflict, it was clear that air power would not simply support the war, it would help decide it. Germany, under the iron vision of Adolf Hitler and the meticulous engineering culture of its aviation firms, had already placed its faith in the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Sleek, angular, and menacing, it was more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of the Reich's ambitions, a blade pointed outward to carve Europe into submission. When German troops stormed into Poland, these fighters screamed overhead, strafing columns, shattering defenses, and announcing a new kind of blitzkrieg, one where armored divisions and aircraft worked as twin fangs of a single predator. The Bf 109 was not born of abundance, but of precision. It was fast, lethal, and capable of holding its own against anything in the skies of 1939. For the Luftwaffe pilots, it was a machine that promised invincibility. To the men on the ground who heard its dive, it was terror incarnate. America, on the other hand, remained far from the European storm. Its factories hummed with civilian goods, its politicians debated neutrality, and its people clung desperately to the belief that oceans could protect them from the fires engulfing Europe. Few in Washington, few even in the Army Air Corps, could have imagined that within a few short years, American factories would dwarf anything the Reich could dream of. But destiny was not yet calling across the Atlantic. In 1939, the United States was still a bystander to history's most dangerous storm. While the Messerschmitt claimed the skies, the Americans had not yet answered with the Mustang. Their story was one of slumber before awakening, of a nation that would be shaken into motion only by catastrophe. Yet when it did awaken, its capacity would astound not only its enemies, but even its own citizens. The Bf 109's early campaigns seemed to justify every boast of the Reich. In Poland, then in Norway, in the Low Countries, and finally in the skies. Over France, the fighter was unmatched in speed, climb rate, and lethality. Its nose-mounted cannon could rip apart enemy bombers, while its machine guns shredded opposing fighters. Pilots like Werner Mulders and Adolf Galland etched their names into the annals of aerial warfare, climbing into their cockpits each morning knowing they were wielding the deadliest instrument of air combat the world had yet seen. The machine was simple enough to mass-produce, rugged enough to operate from hastily prepared airfields, and advanced enough to maintain Germany's aerial edge. By June 1940, when France fell in a matter of weeks, the Messerschmitt had become the icon of Nazi conquest, a winged shadow sweeping across the maps of Europe. The Reich had crafted a weapon of steel and fire, and it seemed unstoppable. Yet destiny is fickle, and air supremacy is never permanent. The Battle of Britain would test both the machine and the men who flew it. For the first time, the Messerschmitt encountered a foe that was not already broken, a nation that refused to kneel. Over English skies, the 109 faced off against the RAF's Hurricanes and Spitfires, and though it inflicted heavy losses, it revealed a crucial flaw: endurance. The fighter had been designed as an interceptor, not as a long-range escort. It could protect German bombers only for a brief time before fuel forced it to turn back across the channel. Its short legs left bombers exposed, its pilots exhausted, and its reputation scarred. The Reich would never achieve the knockout blow against Britain. The Bf 109 was still deadly, but it was not invincible. The seeds of its eventual challenge were sown in those skies where Churchill declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." While Germany pressed its machine into endless battles, the United States was slowly awakening. News of Europe's destruction filtered across the Atlantic, carried by newspapers, radio, and the voices of exiled leaders. American industry, vast but idle in the realm of war, began to prepare. And among the projects born of this shifting mood was an aircraft that at first was not even intended for America's own use. In 1940, the British approached North American aviation with an urgent request: build us a fighter, quickly, and make it capable of holding its own against the Luftwaffe. What followed was one of the most remarkable design stories in aviation history. A fighter sketched, engineered, and flown in record time. Within 120 days, the prototype took to the air. It was sleek, fast, and different. At first, powered by an Allison engine, it was promising but limited. No one yet knew that with a Rolls-Royce Merlin under its cowling, it would evolve into the Mustang, the aircraft that would change the war. In its earliest flights, it was just another machine. In its destiny, it was a legend waiting to be born. Germany, meanwhile, doubled down on its production. Factories worked day and night, hammering out more and more Bf 109s. By war's end, 33,000 would be built, making it the most produced fighter of the conflict. But quantity alone was not enough. The Reich was a continental power under constant siege, its resources strained, its skies contested by an enemy whose production capacity was awakening like a giant. Each Messerschmitt was a deadly machine, but they could never replace the pilots lost in combat, nor could they match the tidal wave of industrial strength that America was preparing to unleash. The story of the Bf 109 is the story of a nation's gamble. Relying on an excellent machine, yes, but betting against an opponent who had yet to commit fully to the fight. And when America finally did commit, when the arsenal of democracy roared into action, it would not just meet Germany in the skies, it would overwhelm it. The Mustang was waiting, and soon it would fly not only in numbers that stunned the world, but with the range and performance to escort bombers deep into the heart of the Reich. The battle lines were being drawn, not only on maps of Europe, but in the blueprints of factories and the minds of engineers. One nation had begun the war with a masterpiece of design. Another would finish it with a masterpiece of industry. The year 1941 was the hinge upon which the destiny of both aircraft and the nations that built them would turn. Germany, having overrun much of Europe, turned its gaze eastward, unleashing Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Thousands of Bf-109s roared into the Soviet Union, their sleek frames cutting across endless steppes, their cannons spitting death at Red Army aircraft caught by surprise. The Messerschmitt became a predator in these skies, engaging sluggish Soviet biplanes and obsolete designs with lethal efficiency. Pilots like Erich Hartmann and Günter Rahl would rack up astonishing kill counts, sometimes downing multiple enemy aircraft in a single sortie. To these men, the 109 was more than a machine. It was a trusted companion, a blade honed for the duels they fought daily in the thin air above frozen forests and burning fields. The Eastern Front became a crucible, both for Germany's pilots and for the aircraft they flew, as the sheer scale of the fighting demanded endurance that no machine or human was truly built to withstand. Yet the 109 carried within it both strength and limitation. In the vastness of Russia, its short range again became evident. Luftwaffe pilots could only fight close to their bases, leaving entire regions of the Soviet Union beyond their reach. The Red Air Force, though battered and bleeding, learned to adapt. New designs like the Yak-9 and LA-5 began to appear, tougher, faster, more competitive. The Messerschmitt still scored victories in staggering numbers, but it was increasingly fighting not outdated machines, but worthy challengers. Germany was caught in a paradox. It was producing fighters in huge numbers, but the war it had unleashed required even more, and the pilots who flew them were stretched beyond exhaustion. What looked like dominance on paper was in truth the beginning of attrition, a slow bleed that the Reich's industrial heart could not sustain forever. Across the ocean, America's slumber ended in fire at Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft tore into the U.S. Pacific Fleet, dragging the reluctant giant into total war. Overnight, neutrality was dead, and with it the notion that America could remain a bystander. Factories that had once built cars, refrigerators, and civilian airplanes were seized by war production boards and retooled to churn out fighters, bombers, and tanks. The arsenal of democracy, as Franklin Roosevelt had promised, roared to life with a fury that stunned even its allies. It was not just steel and aluminum that these factories produced, but hope that the Allies could now match the inexhaustible demands of modern war. For aviation, this was the turning point. Designs that had been on drawing boards or flying in limited numbers now received orders in the tens of thousands, and among them was the Mustang, still relatively unknown, still finding its purpose but destined for greatness. At first, the Mustang was a machine looking for its role. Early versions, powered by the Allison engine, proved effective at low altitudes but lacked performance above 15,000 feet, where the war in Europe was increasingly fought. It was a good aircraft, but not yet extraordinary. Then came a stroke of genius. Marrying the Mustang's airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, this union transformed the aircraft. Suddenly, it could fight at high altitudes with blistering speed, exceptional maneuverability, and, most importantly, astonishing range. The P-51B and later P-51D models became the long-sought answer to a problem that had haunted the Allies since the bombing campaigns began. The lack of an escort fighter capable of flying with bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Where the Bf-109 was shackled by short range, the Mustang was liberated by its endurance. It could fly deep into enemy territory, linger in combat, and still return home. This was not just a technical advantage, it was a strategic revolution. For Germany, this shift was catastrophic. By 1942 and 1943, Allied bombers poured across the Channel, targeting factories, oil fields, and cities. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s scrambled to intercept, and in many cases they inflicted terrible losses. Bomber crews nicknamed their daylight missions suicide runs, watching as Messerschmitt slashed through their formations, setting B-17s ablaze, sending them tumbling from the sky. But the 109s could not be everywhere at once, and without long-range escorts, the bombers were vulnerable. For a time it seemed Germany might still stave off destruction, that sheer bravery and skill in the cockpit could offset the Allies' industrial tide. But the Mustang was coming, and with it the balance would shift irreversibly. When Mustangs began to appear alongside bombers, the skies changed. The hunters became the hunted. No longer could the 109s attack with impunity. Now they faced swarms of agile escorts, each capable of matching or surpassing them in speed and firepower, and able to follow them all the way back to their bases. The Reich's shield was cracking. Still, the Messerschmitt was not a relic. Engineers continually upgraded it, adding more powerful engines, heavier armament, and modifications to keep it competitive. Even in 1944, the Bf 109 remained a formidable opponent, capable of downing Mustangs in skilled hands. Its kill record remains unmatched in aviation history. Pilots flying it scored more victories than any other fighter type, largely due to the brutal and prolonged nature of the Eastern Front. But war is not won by machines alone. It is won by sustaining men, resources, and production. Here, Germany faltered. Its factories were bombed, its fuel supplies strangled, its veteran pilots replaced by green recruits with only a handful of flight hours. The Bf 109 was still deadly, but in the hands of inexperienced men against swarms of well-trained Allied pilots, it was increasingly a symbol of futility. The very machine that had once carried the Reich's dreams of conquest became the coffin for thousands of young men hurled into impossible odds. In contrast, America's production of the Mustang surged. By the end of the war, 49,000 would roll off assembly lines, each representing not just industrial might, but a philosophy that air power could win wars if given the right tools. The Mustang escorted bombers on raids that crippled German industry, shattered morale, and left cities in ruins. Its pilots gained reputations as knights of the air, dueling Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, carving paths through flak and fire to protect the lumbering giants of the bomber streams. For bomber crews, the sight of P-51s appearing on their wings as they crossed into Germany was salvation itself. They knew they were no longer alone, no longer defenseless. The Mustang had tipped the balance, not just in numbers, but in spirit. Thus, the contest between the Bf 109 and the Mustang was more than a clash of machines. It was the clash of two philosophies of war. One, a weapon forged early, wielded with ruthless precision, but ultimately limited by the resources of a nation strained to breaking. The other, a weapon forged later, but backed by a nation whose factories were endless and whose will to fight had been awakened in full. Germany built 33,000 Messerschmitts. America rolled out 49,000 Mustangs. But behind those numbers lies the story of industrial mobilization, of sacrifice, and of the simple truth that in modern war, production capacity is as decisive as courage in combat. By 1943, the air war over Europe had become a relentless storm, and at its heart, two fighters clashed for supremacy. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, defender of the Reich, and the P-51 Mustang, the newcomer whose shadow was beginning to stretch across the continent. The skies themselves had changed. No longer were they the exclusive hunting grounds of a few hundred aircraft. Now, thousands filled the heavens. Contrails stretched like white scars across the blue. Formations of bombers darkened the daylight, and dogfights erupted in swirling chaos that stretched for miles. For the men who strapped themselves into cockpits, there was no romance left in this war of the air. It was a daily crucible of fear, adrenaline, and survival, where seconds decided fates and every flight could be the last. To tell the story of these aircraft in this period is to tell the story of courage against inevitability, of machines pushed to their limits, and of men caught between duty and death. The Messerschmitt, though still formidable, was increasingly burdened by the weight of history pressing down upon it. Its design, conceived in the mid-1930s, was being asked to fight against newer, more advanced machines. Engineers worked feverishly to upgrade it, stretching its capabilities, adding horsepower, thicker armor, and heavier weapons. The 109G Gustav series carried cannons powerful enough to shatter Allied bombers, but these modifications also made it heavier, less agile, and more difficult to handle for inexperienced pilots. Yet Germany had no choice. It needed quantity, and it needed it fast. The Luftwaffe poured young men into cockpits after only a few weeks of training, sending them to duel against seasoned Allied pilots flying machines that combined range, speed, and firepower. The 109 remained deadly in skilled hands. But the Luftwaffe's veteran cadre was thinning, and each loss was irreplaceable. In America, meanwhile, the war machine was hitting full stride. The Mustang was no longer experimental, it was operational, mass-produced, and lethal. P-51 groups were assigned to bomber escort duties, and their impact was immediate. Where once German fighters could tear into bomber streams with little opposition, now they were met with fierce resistance. Mustang pilots hunted not just for protection, but for dominance. They sought out the Luftwaffe in its own skies, diving on Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs with devastating effect. The psychological shift was enormous. For years, German pilots had been the aggressors. Now, increasingly, they were reacting, forced onto the defensive, scrambling to meet raids that seemed endless. The Reich's once proud Luftwaffe was no longer dictating the terms of battle. It was fighting for survival. Yet even amid the tide turning against them, the Messerschmitt's legacy grew. It became the mount of the highest-scoring aces in history. Erich Hartmann, flying a Bf 109, would eventually amass 352 aerial victories, a number so staggering it seems almost mythical. Others, like Gerhard Barkhorn and Günter Rahl, achieved hundreds of kills each, their names etched into aviation history. These pilots proved what the machine could do in the hands of masters, but their very success revealed another truth. These victories were often against ill-prepared Soviet or Allied pilots in the early stages of their service. As the war dragged on, as the Mustang appeared in greater numbers, even the best aces could not reverse the tide. The 109 was still a predator, but it was now hunted in turn, and each duel grew more desperate. The Mustang, by contrast, embodied not just performance, but endurance. With its long range, it escorted bombers on missions that reached deep into Germany, striking at oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, and transportation hubs, the very arteries of the Reich's war machine. When the Luftwaffe tried to mount concentrated defenses, Mustangs slashed through their formations, breaking them apart. The skies over Germany became killing grounds, and the losses mounted at an unsustainable rate. Pilots who had once believed in their invincibility found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced. The 109 had once been the symbol of dominance. Now it was the symbol of defiance, a machine fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. Still, both aircraft represented more than metal and fuel. To their pilots, they were lifelines. For a German pilot, climbing into the cockpit of a Bf 109 meant stepping into the last shield of the Reich, the last chance to defend homeland and family from the rain of bombs above. For an American pilot, strapping into a Mustang meant carrying not just his own life, but the hopes of the bomber crews counting on his protection. Each machine was a vessel of duty, a crucible of identity, and a coffin in waiting. And in that shared experience of risk and survival, the two sides, though enemies, were bound by a common humanity, each looking into the same cold sky, each feeling the same fear as tracer rounds tore past their wings. By the close of 1943, the air war had entered a new phase. The Messerschmitt still roared, still struck down enemies with precision, still bore the marks of German engineering genius, but the Mustang was now fully in the fight, and with it came the weight of America's industrial power. One fighter was the weapon of a nation straining under the burden of total war. The other was the weapon of a nation that had only just begun to unleash its full might. Their clash was not simply a duel of aircraft, but of philosophies, economies, and destinies. One was fighting to preserve conquest, the other was fighting to end tyranny. By 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its crescendo. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, once the terror of the skies, now faced the full weight of America's industrial avalanche. From dawn to dusk, the rumble of engines never ceased. Thousands of bombers filled the air, escorted by swarms of Mustangs whose silver wings caught the sunlight and reflected it like blades of light. To German civilians gazing upward, the sky seemed alive with steel, a moving city of war machines that blotted out the heavens. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare realized. Endless raids, endless battles, endless loss. And at the center of it, the Messerschmitt, forced to fight not as a weapon of dominance, but as a shield of desperation. In those days, German pilots were flung into combat with scarcely enough training to master their machines. Where once aces had ruled, now boys barely out of adolescence climbed into cockpits, their hands trembling as they adjusted controls, their eyes scanning the skies with terror rather than confidence. The Bf 109, though still capable, had become unforgiving. Its narrow landing gear caused crashes on takeoff and landing. Its powerful engine demanded skill, and its heavier armament made it less agile than in its glory days. Veterans could still wield it like a sword, but rookies too often turned it into a coffin, and yet every flight mattered. For the Reich was collapsing, and each 109 sent aloft represented not just a fighter, but a flicker of defiance against inevitability. Meanwhile, the Mustang was ascending to legend. Its long, graceful wings carried it across Germany with ease, its Merlin engine singing a high-pitched symphony of power. Pilots loved the machine not only for its performance, but for its reliability. It was a partner, a guardian, a machine that could bring them home. When Mustangs began to strafe airfields, trains, and convoys, their role expanded beyond bomber escort. They became predators sweeping across the Reich, tearing at its infrastructure with surgical ferocity. German supply lines disintegrated under their guns, fuel depots erupted in flames, and railways ground to a halt. The war in the air was no longer just a defense of bombers. It was total, systematic destruction from above. The contrast between the two machines was starkest in strategy. The Messerschmitt, designed as a short-range interceptor, was now a reluctant defender, scrambling in small numbers against swarms. The Mustang, designed late but perfected at the right moment, was the embodiment of endurance, dictating when and where battles occurred. For the pilots, this contrast meant everything. A German pilot often took off already knowing the odds were against him, while an American pilot took off with the confidence of numbers, range, and support. The battlefield was not fair. It was tilted by industry, by fuel, by training, and by sheer production. Germany had built 33,000 Messerschmitts, but America could always build more, faster, with pilots trained longer, supported by logistics Germany could no longer dream of. And yet, courage remained. Accounts from the period tell of German pilots pressing home attacks against overwhelming formations, diving into bomber streams, even as Mustang escorts swarmed. Some fought to the very end, ramming bombers when ammunition was gone, choosing sacrifice over surrender. For these men, the 109 was no longer just a fighter, it was a final stand. The Mustang pilots too faced mortal danger. Though better trained and better supported, they knew each mission could end in a burst of flak or a sudden strike from a desperate foe. Dogfights were vicious, swirling melees where survival often came down to instinct and luck. In those moments, stripped of politics and ideology, it was man against man, machine against machine, survival against oblivion. By mid-1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the skies were firmly under Mustang control. The Luftwaffe could not stop the tide of Allied bombers that pulverized defenses, railways, and bridges ahead. Of D-Day, on June 6th, when Allied troops stormed ashore, the Bf 109 was conspicuously absent in large numbers. Its presence was scattered, fragmented, too weak to mount a serious challenge. The Reich's once proud shield had been broken, and the Mustang was now the sword that cleared the path for liberation. The clash of these two fighters had come to symbolize the Greater War itself. Germany's early brilliance giving way to exhaustion, America's later rival transforming into overwhelming dominance. Still, for all its losses, the Messerschmitt did not vanish. It fought on to the very end of the war. Even in 1945, Bf 109s scrambled against Allied raids, their numbers dwindling, their pilots often untested, but their spirit unbroken. Against them, Mustangs prowled with relentless determination, swatting down stragglers, ensuring no resurgence was possible. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the Allies, and the Mustang reigned supreme as the war's defining fighter. But beneath the statistics and the numbers, beneath the industrial might and the strategies, lay a deeper truth. Both machines were flown by men, flesh and blood, who climbed into them with fear and resolve, who soared into combat knowing each flight might be their last. Their machines made history, but their humanity gave that history meaning. As 1944 bled into 1945, the war in the skies took on a new, almost tragic character. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, once the herald of conquest, was now the emblem of a collapsing empire. Its wings still cut the air, its guns still spat fire, but the purpose had changed. No longer was it the spearhead of blitzkrieg. Now it was the shield of a dying Reich, rising in dwindling numbers against an enemy whose resources seemed limitless. Germany's cities lay in ruins, its factories shattered, its fuel reserves nearly exhausted. And still young men strapped themselves into cockpits, staring down the overwhelming might of Allied air power, with nothing but determination and a machine that was at once a marvel and a relic. Each sortie was an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender even when defeat was all but certain. The Mustang, by contrast, had reached its zenith. By 1945, swarms of P-51s filled the skies, not only escorting bombers, but ranging deep into enemy territory, striking at anything that moved. They strafed rail yards, convoys, airfields, even enemy fighters before they could take off. To German civilians, the sight of a Mustang overhead was not just a reminder of defeat, but of omnipresence. The Allies controlled the skies completely, and no corner of the Reich was safe. For the American pilots, the Mustang had become more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of inevitability, a machine that carried them into the heart of the enemy's homeland and promised to bring them back. Its long legs, its speed, its reliability, all combined to make it not just a weapon of war, but a partner in survival. Yet this phase of the air war was not simply a tale of dominance and collapse. It was also a tale of human cost. In the last months of the war, Luftwaffe squadrons were often filled with boys, barely trained, terrified, hurled into cockpits with only a handful of hours in the air. Against them came seasoned Mustang veterans, men who had flown dozens of missions, who knew the tactics, who knew how to exploit every weakness. The duels were brutally one-sided. Accounts speak of Mustangs cutting through green German formations, with lethal precision, leaving wreckage and fire in their wake. And yet even in these hopeless battles, moments of courage shone. Some German pilots fought with extraordinary bravery, defying the odds to score victories, even to the very end. Their machines were battered, their homeland in ruins, but their resolve was undiminished. In those final flights, the Bf-109 became less a weapon of conquest and more a symbol of tragic endurance. The Mustang pilots too bore their burdens. Though they had superiority, each mission was still a gamble with death. Flak batteries remained deadly, and desperate German jets, the revolutionary Me-262s, added new dangers. Mustangs often found themselves diving against these jets on takeoff, or landing, knowing that if they reached the skies, they could devastate bomber formations. The war in the air was never easy, never without cost. Mustang pilots spoke of friends lost in flashes of fire, of missions that ended in silence over enemy territory. Victory did not dull the grief. For every silver plane that returned home, there were empty bunks, folded flags, and names written into memory. Behind the roar of the Merlin engine was always the whisper of mortality. What makes the contrast between the Bf-109 and the P-51 in these final months so powerful is how perfectly they mirrored their nations. Germany, exhausted, desperate, fighting, with brilliance but starved of fuel, pilots and hope. America, surging forward with overwhelming strength, sustaining losses but always able to replace men, machines and munitions. The Messerschmitt represented a fading past, a weapon built in the confidence of early victories, now asked to do the impossible. The Mustang represented the future, a weapon born of adaptation, forged in partnership and sustained by industry. One was running out of time, the other was defining an era. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany were no longer battlefields, they were highways of Allied power. Mustangs flew low over ruined cities, strafing anything that moved, ensuring that nothing could escape. The Bf-109s still rose, still fought, still clawed for survival, but they were ghosts of their former glory, hunted from the moment their wheels left the ground. When Berlin finally fell, when the Reich collapsed into ashes, the Messerschmitt's roar faded with it. The Mustang, however, still roared, not only in Europe but soon in Asia, escorting bombers against Japan, preparing for an invasion that would never come. The war had been decided, and in the tale of these two aircraft, the larger story of the conflict was written. Brilliance could win battles, but only endurance could win wars. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the contrast between the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the P-51 Mustang lingered in the silence above Europe's shattered landscapes. The Reich had built 33,000 of its fighters, a staggering number by any measure, yet its cities lay in ruins, its people broken, its empire gone. America had rolled out 49,000 Mustangs, and when peace returned, those aircraft still lined airfields in gleaming rows, their engines ready, their wings unscarred by scarcity. The story of these two machines did not end with victory or defeat on the battlefield. It echoed into the post-war world, shaping aviation, memory, and the very identity of nations. The Bf-109 had been born in ambition and ended in tragedy. The Mustang had been born in urgency and ended in triumph. Together, they told a single truth: that the skies are unforgiving, and that war in the air is as much about the factories and workers as it is about the pilots who dare to fly. The Messerschmitt's legacy after the war was complicated. For some, it was a symbol of technological brilliance, an aircraft that had carried aces to impossible heights of achievement. Its silhouette remained iconic, its record unmatched. For others, it was forever tied to the dark shadow of the regime. It served, a machine that had once darkened the skies of Europe in the service of conquest. Scattered examples found new homes in the air forces of nations like Spain and Finland, flying on for years after the Reich had collapsed, but they were echoes of a vanished world. Each restored 109 on a modern airshow field is a reminder not just of engineering genius, but of the human cost that genius was bent to serve. The Mustang's legacy was far more luminous. It became the darling of post-war aviation, serving in air forces around the globe, from Europe to Asia to Latin America. Its long range and superb performance made it invaluable not only in World War II, but in the Korean War, where it strafed ground targets and dual jet fighters in an entirely new era of combat. Veterans remembered it with affection, calling it the plane that saved them, the machine that turned the tide. To civilians, the sight of a Mustang's polished fuselage became a symbol of American power, freedom, and technological prowess. Even today, the sound of its Merlin engine stirs nostalgia and reverence, a living echo of an age when the skies were filled with fire. And yet, in comparing the Bf-109 and the Mustang, one cannot escape the deeper reflection that emerges. Battle between them was not just about design, performance, or even tactics. It was about the capacity of nations to sustain war, to feed machines with resources, to train pilots in numbers, to replace what was lost. Germany's 33,000 Messerschmitts were remarkable, but they were produced by a nation strangled by blockade, bombed relentlessly, deprived of oil and steel. America's 49,000 Mustangs were produced by a nation untouched at home, blessed with vast resources, and driven by a collective will to win. The comparison is not simply about fighters. It is about the industrial age itself, and how war had become a contest of economies as much as armies. For the men who flew them, however, the machines were never statistics. Each cockpit was a world unto itself, a place where courage was tested, against fear, where seconds stretched into eternities, where the line between life and death was as thin as a turn of the rudder. German pilots spoke of the howl of Mustangs diving from the sun, of the hopelessness of fighting outnumbered, of the bitter pride of defending their homeland to the last. American pilots spoke of endless missions over hostile territory, of friends lost in fiery spirals, of the relief of seeing home soil after hours over enemy skies. Both sides carried scars that would last lifetimes, invisible wounds etched deeper than any tally mark painted on a fuselage. What makes their story endure is not just the statistics or the engineering, but the way it mirrors the human condition. The Bf-109 was proof of human brilliance twisted into conquest. The Mustang was proof of human brilliance harnessed to liberation. Both were flown by men barely out of youth, asked to carry the weight of nations on their shoulders, asked to kill, and to survive, asked to live with the memories long after the war had ended. To study these two machines is to study humanity itself, the genius, the folly, the resilience, and the tragedy. They remind us that in the skies, as on the ground, victory is never simple and survival is never guaranteed. Even as decades have passed, the echoes of their struggle remain. Airshows across the world feature restored Mustangs, their engines roaring as crowds look up in awe, their polished bodies gleaming in sunlight. A handful of Messerschmitts still fly, their angular frames snarling in defiance of time. When they share the sky, even in peace, the audience witnesses more than a display of aviation history. They witness the ghosts of a time when the world was consumed by fire, when young men fought and died in machines of aluminum and steel, when freedom and tyranny clashed not just on the ground, but in the limitless expanse above. Their duel is over, but their story endures, etched into the sky itself. History remembers numbers: 33,000 Bf-109s, 49,000 P-51 Mustangs, but numbers alone cannot tell the story. To speak only of statistics is to strip away the souls who lived and died in these machines, the lives shattered and preserved, the courage and the fear. What truly endures is the human heartbeat beneath the roar of engines, the trembling hands gripping controls, the prayers whispered in cockpits before the dive. For every Messerschmitt that lifted into the dawn, there was a young man inside, often exhausted, often afraid, but unwilling to surrender. For every Mustang that carved across Europe, there was a pilot scanning the sky, aching for home, knowing that every mission might be his last. These aircraft were not just machines. They were vessels of human will, carrying hopes, burdens, and destinies into the endless blue. The duel between the 109 and the Mustang was never just mechanical. It was philosophical. The Messerschmitt had been born in an era of ambition, crafted for an empire that sought domination. Its very design carried the arrogance of speed, the confidence of superiority. Yet by the end, it became a desperate guardian, bleeding for survival, stripped of the arrogance it once symbolized. The Mustang, by contrast, was born of necessity, not pride. It was built to solve a problem, to protect bombers, to carry the fight deeper than ever before. Its genius was not just in its speed or range, but in its adaptability, its ability to answer the moment history demanded. That is why, decades later, it still flies in skies of peace, while the 109 lingers only as a shadow of what was. But the truth is not so simple as winners and losers. Both machines carried men into the crucible of fire. Both machines demanded sacrifice. Both machines gave birth to legends who are still remembered in books, in museums, in the collective memory of nations. German aces like Erich Hartmann, who scored hundreds of victories, sat in the same cockpit as frightened boys who never survived their first sortie. American pilots like Bud Anderson and Chuck Yeager strapped into Mustangs and found both triumph and grief at 30,000 feet. These men, regardless of uniform, shared the same thin thread of survival, the same isolation of being alone in the sky, with only their instincts and their machine. They were enemies, but they were also brothers of the air, bound by an experience so rare and terrible that only they could truly understand it. In the decades that followed, their stories began to converge. Former foes met at reunions, shook hands, shared drinks, and spoke of the days when they tried to kill each other. They discovered what war had tried to hide from them, that the enemy was not so different, that the man in the cockpit across the sky was just as young, just as mortal, just as desperate to live. In these meetings, the Messerschmitt and the Mustang ceased to be symbols of division. They became bridges, reminders that even in the darkest hours, humanity remains. The machines that once carried destruction became catalysts for reconciliation. Their roars replaced by conversations, their battles by memories, and perhaps that is the deepest legacy of these two aircraft. They are no longer tools of war, but mirrors. They reflect our capacity for invention, for courage, for resilience, but also our capacity for destruction, for arrogance, for loss. They remind us that technology is never neutral. It carries the imprint of the hands that build it and the purpose of the hearts that wield it. The Bf-109, brilliant but doomed, shows the peril of genius bent toward tyranny. The Mustang, victorious but costly, shows the power of unity and industry harnessed for liberation. Together, they teach that victory in war is never free, that every gleaming machine is paid for in human blood, that behind every statistic lies a name, a face, a family left waiting. The skies of Europe are quiet now. No more dogfights trace their spirals above the clouds. No more bombers rumble eastward under escort. Instead, there is silence, broken only by the occasional growl of a restored engine at an air show, a living ghost that makes heads turn upward. When a Mustang passes overhead today, children cheer, veterans weep, and history stirs. When a Messerschmitt snarls beside it, there is awe, but also a chill, a reminder of the darker half of memory. Together, they dance in peace, embodying a paradox. Machines built for destruction, now celebrated in peace. They are relics, but they are also warnings. They remind us of what was lost and of what can never be lost again. And so, the story closes. Germany built 33,000 Bf-109s. America rolled out 49,000 Mustangs. Between those numbers lies an ocean of lives, of dreams broken and fulfilled, of battles fought and lessons learned. The Bf-109 and the P-51 are not just aircraft, they are symbols of humanity's highest genius and deepest folly. Their duel in the skies of World War II was more than a contest of machines. It was a reflection of who we are, of the choices we make, of the futures we forge. They leave us with a question. When we build, when we create, will we choose conquest or liberation, tyranny or freedom? That choice, like the roar of engines fading into the horizon, belongs to us.